that's the other thing. I've had trouble with thicker papers trying to backcoat them together, and I think other people have had better success. But the thicker you go with the paper, the harder it is going to be to stick two sheets together. And I'm not really sure if there's a better technique to get.
Start mixing it with stronger,
Yeah. Oh,
faster drying stuff.
you can
so
add
start
a little
mixing
bit.
with
Oh,
PVA.
here's something. You can you can add a little bit of. So you you have your methyl cellulose mixture, and then you add white glue. We can say PVA, but it's Elmer's glue. There's some better quality archival PVA type glue that and a little bit more diluted, or when you're mixing it in, so it's going to be diluted. So you've got a glue and methyl cellulose mixture, and then it's going to, and that's, yes, I have had success with that, more success with that.
But that one you don't want to store because it does spoil. When you mix the PVA, even though PVA by itself doesn't spoil.
It doesn't.
MC doesn't spoil, but when you mix the two of them together, it can.
I store mine for a while, like
you,
a couple months, it won't spoil. But you might not want to let it, I haven't, what's that?
Is that in the refrigerator now?
So I've actually had just methyl cellulose spoil because of the fibers that end up getting in it. And if you're gonna mix up a really big batch, what I would do is in a really clean container mix up a big batch and then pour out what you need into a working container so that your batch stays
Clean.
Sanitized and you don't contaminate it with anything.
yeah.
But
Yeah, I'll say that's a really good idea. I don't do that. And sometimes I get little fibers in my big.
yeah, well, it's also frustrating when you do end up, if you're dipping out of your container and then you have fibers of the paper, and then when you do your next sheet of a different color, you're putting fibers on
paper and the colors start bleeding.
Yeah,
And you get that mixed in with your big batch of MC, so now everything you make turns pink or brown or blue or whatever.
Although I once experimented with adding mica pigment to
that works great,
cellulose. Yeah, to give like a color sheen.
Does that work really nice?
It works fine. It's a really subtle effect. I mean, you've got to actually kind of look at it to see the.
Can you backcoat watercolor?
Yeah, it'll be real thick.
I have not had luck with that. Maybe if you take a sheet of Enrayu, let's say you took a thin sheet of this and you backcoat it to a piece of like Canson or even Arches. I've seen people do that.
Really?
So you're taking, this, because this sheet's so thin, it will stick to, you haven't seen that? Like Arches, has anybody else seen that? Canson or Arches? You might want to, if it starts unpeeling, then you might want to try mixing a little bit of glue in with that MC, but I think that works. But
So,
you can't do two
one-
sheets of Arches together, that won't.
One major challenge with that though is that the Canson or Arches watercolor paper, those are all machine made. They have a grain and they will expand more in one direction than the other. The handmade papers don't have a grain; they expand, but they expand relatively evenly. So what you'll have is when it shrinks, when it dries, it's going to shrink. One of the papers is going to shrink in one direction, and the other is going to shrink more uniformly, and you're going to have probably more issues with buckling or delamination.
So what people do with something that's heavier like that, more commonly used, is to paint one side of the paper, which is an art in and of itself too. It's also very challenging.
That's a different class that was
It's a
yesterday.
Was it? Was there a class yesterday?
There's a
Yeah.
table in the great
Oh.
room for painting paper.
That's a
there all
little bit
day.
different too, though. I think specifically working with the watercolor paper, like what Yang Din, his type of work where he has, because I asked him for advice because I was struggling to try to get that. And really the key is, and now I don't want to get too far off track, but it does go into wet folding. It's wet folding, right?
Yeah.
Is to dilute any kind of acrylic paint. So you want to just add thinner layers to and then kind of build up to maybe the tone that you want. Because if you put too thick of a coat of paint on there, it looks almost like just another
It's not
plasticky
paper.
coating, and
Yeah.
it's not. When it's diluted, it's a little bit more watery. It actually kind of soaks in and looks like the color actually has that tone, as opposed to a layer of paint on top of the paper. And then, as it's drying, you fold it. So you're wet folding it. It's a two-part process. The paper gets wet from the paint, and then you work with it while it's actually drying, which is how you have to work with that paper. And I'll just say just 1 minute on this because I don't want to take away too much from the main focus of this, but that's what so there's wet folding is what we've been doing here when you're working with this really complex model, thin paper, you're using MC and shaping and getting nice curves. But it's also probably more traditionally like what Yoshizawa did, is working with a heavier watercolor type paper, really thick paper that doesn't take a crease very well unless it's wet. And you also then can get some nice curved folds or nicer, more organic lines. You really have to work with it when it's wet, or else it'll crack when you fold it.
I'm passing around this little devil model that I wet folded from a heavier Canson paper.
Awesome. Yeah, that's you guys have, I'm sure you've seen that kind of work with the heavier. And then when that dries, it's almost like plaster. I mean, it just and you don't add anything to that paper. It's all that sizing's already in that paper. And if I don't know, if you want to, if anybody's interested in experimenting with that, Malachi, who is our kind of paper dealer, he's always like, hey, just try this new paper that he has. He's always passing out samples. He has a bunch of Canson here. This is a heavier type watercolor paper that people like to wet fold, and you can use your spray bottle and just get it kind of damp. You get it kind of so it's a little soft. You don't want to saturate it, and then you just start folding. And that's you just experiment with it.
So
there's not a right process.
The thing to know about wet folding is that wet folding is a terrible name that is very misleading. So the first time damp folding would be better. The first time I tried to wet fold was a long time ago, and I read in a book, one of Montreal's books talked about wet folding, and I took a piece of printer paper and I got it soaking wet, and then I had a pile of mush. And really what you want to do is you want to get it just damp enough that it's like cool to the touch and pliable. If it's shiny, leave it alone for a minute, let it dry to the point that it's no longer shiny and it doesn't feel like it's wet, but it's just damp enough that you can tell that it's not just, yes.
Well, finish your thought and.
Well, that's pretty much it. You want it to just be.
And then you have to kind of, depending on what you're folding, you typically have to continue to get it wet while you're working, and you preferably, because of what John said, that the paper starts disintegrating, you want to get just the part maybe that you're working on wet, or just spray it really lightly. This is a very different process, wet folding this, than it is wet folding, if you want to call it wet folding, something like this.
Yeah.
It's a very different
So
process.
for complex things, you know, it's something that's going to take like a couple. This is the octopus that I passed around earlier, but something like that, something that's more complex from the thinner paper. And thinner paper is you need a ton less water than you do for a real thick paper like Canson. Canson can take a lot of water compared to this real thin paper that we've been using. I typically use just like what would be like a single sheet of what you guys backcoated.
And when
like
you're, John, when you're working on a complex model, you would moisten one area of it that you're working on sometimes.
Yes. Well, what I do for a complex model, it's going to take a few hours. You know, thin paper dries out really quickly because it's higher surface area to volume ratio for the nerds among us. But you would fold it dry because it's going to take a really long time to get all those pre-creases in and collapse everything down, and that will take however long to fold it dry to close to the finished shape. And then, like John said, I'll take a small area and wet that and then shape it and maybe let that dry or maybe work on some other area at the same time. But for something complex like that, I'll also use not just water, but some combination of water and or methyl cellulose and or PVA, the white glue that we were talking about earlier. For a lot of complex stuff, using some glue at least is really nice because you can compress layers and get them to stick together and shape things nicely, and you get them to stay into place a little bit nicer than you could with just water alone.
Also, one of the things about PVA and methylcellulose, they have different drying times. So PVA dries really fast. Within a couple minutes, it already starts getting really tacky, and like layers will start sticking together. And it'll be basically dry in an hour. It'll still be technically wet, but it'll be solid, in place. It'll take a week for it to be truly fully dry, unless you like put it in the microwave or something. I've done that. Don't make sure if you use wires, take those out first.
Foil.
Only do like
Hair dryer.
20 or 30 seconds at a time, otherwise you might get some singe marks on the
Yeah.
edges. of the
But so
paper.
methylcellulose dries a lot slower, right? So it'll take it takes many hours for it to dry. So what I'll do is I'll make a mix of PVA and methylcellulose. I use about 80% PVA, 20% methylcellulose. So it still dries pretty quick. Now it's more like a half hour to an hour, but it gives enough time. So like when you have these things with lots and lots and lots of layers, you need to be able to paint all of them with the glue before they're too tacky, that they won't even stick together anymore. Like that's how I did my octopus upstairs, or wherever it is.
I've seen you guys using a small paintbrush and literally just like paint the
Literally
PVA between the layers
between every single layer.
and then compress it together so it's all folded and ready
Yeah.
to go. And you just paint it in. And
So an example of this, in addition to anything that you guys have, there's an ancient dragon I folded in the exhibit, and I dry folded it to the point. It's origami paper. I dry folded it to the finish point, and then I did like 1 foot with MC, shaped it the way I wanted, let it dry. The next day I came back into the next foot, and you know, it took probably about 6 hours total, broken up over a week as I did each little detail. When you do that, you often need to have something to hold it in the shape that you want while you let it dry.
I use twist ties.
There's twist ties, although you have to be careful not to have it apply pressure in one spot and not another, so that you know distort the finished product.
Right.
For some things, I use like clips. Jamie Kelly swears by this kind of clip that's for like a clothes hanger, because these, for whatever reason, don't leave as much of a mark.
It's padding on the.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that, well, if you're using just MC, especially depending on the thickness of it, it can take a really long time for MC to dry, and it doesn't have a lot of holding power until it is really close to being dry. So that's when it's really important to have something to hold your model in place. Also, if you're just using water and relying on the internal sizing of the paper, you're essentially relying on metal cellulose, except it's already in the paper instead of external MC that you're adding as you're wet folding. So it's still going to take a really long time to dry and hold into place. But if you use PVA, since it's so tacky and dries so quickly, you know, essentially as you're working with it, it has a lot more holding power than just straight up metal cellulose as you're folding things. I find in a lot of cases, if you're using PVA or some mixture of PVA and methyl cellulose, you don't really need to hold things in place, and certainly not nearly as much as if you're just using methyl cellulose or just water when you're folding.
It'll shift by centimeters or something like that. It'll shift by that much.
by the way, about 20 minutes left.
20 minutes left? Cool.